Most people think medieval battles were decided by bold charges, heroic duels, and clean lines of steel clashing in open fields. That image is powerful and largely wrong. What actually determined the outcome of most medieval battles was confusion, fatigue, miscommunication, terrain, and the simple physical limits of the human body. Battles were rarely elegant. They were slow to begin, difficult to control, and often decided before the first serious contact ever occurred. If you strip away the cinematic framing, a medieval battle looks less like choreographed chaos and more like a fragile system under strain. Cohesion was everything. Once cohesion failed, once units stopped responding to signals, once men lost sight of their banner, once fear or exhaustion fractured formation, the battle was effectively over. Most casualties did not occur in the dramatic clash at the beginning, but during pursuit when one side broke and ran. Understanding that single reality changes how we understand medieval warfare entirely. What actually happened in a medieval battle begins long before the first weapon was raised. Before the battle even began, survival and logistics were already deciding outcomes. Armies in the medieval period were not permanent, professional institutions in most regions. They were temporary coalitions of feudal levies, household retainers, mercenaries, and local militias. Many soldiers were farmers first and fighters second. Campaigning season followed agricultural cycles for a reason. By the time two armies faced each other, they were often already weakened. Men had marched for days or weeks. Supplies were uncertain, armor was heavy, diets were inconsistent. Dehydration and dysentery were common, horses were underfed. Commanders were making decisions not only based on enemy movement, but on how long they could realistically keep their own force intact without disintegration. Battles were risky precisely because armies were expensive and fragile. A single defeat could destroy a noble's political power for a generation. That is why many campaigns consisted of maneuver, raiding, and siege rather than open battle. Leaders avoided battle unless they believed conditions strongly favored them. When battle did occur, it was usually because someone felt cornered, overconfident, or compelled by political pressure. Command and control were honestly pretty fragile systems built mostly on sight and sound. There were no radios and, well, no real-time battlefield maps either. Orders moved only as fast as a rider could gallop or as quickly as someone could shout. Once those formations started to advance, it deteriorated really quickly. Medieval armies had to rely on visual markers, things like banners, heraldic colors, and, recognizable armor, to keep everyone in line. Drums, horns, and shouted signals could only convey the simplest instructions: advance, hold, or withdraw. But with all the smoke, dust, tricky terrain, and just plain human panic, these signals often became really tough to interpret. Once the fighting really began, commanders had, pretty limited influence. A general could set up the troops and pick the ground, but as soon as the lines clashed, the battle basically became decentralized. Sub-commanders and even the leaders of small units were the ones who determined survival right there on the ground. If a wing started to falter, there was, honestly, no practical way to restore it. This limitation actually shaped later military doctrine. Over time, more disciplined formations, like the Swiss pike squares or, later, those early modern infantry blocks, developed exactly because cohesion under stress proved so decisive. Medieval battles showed, time and again, that morale and formation stability mattered way more than individual heroics. The first contact between armies was, rarely cinematic. It was tense and uncertain. Contrary to what modern portrayals might suggest, opposing armies didn't always just rush at each other at full speed. Engagement often began pretty cautiously. Missile troops, archers, crossbowmen, or skirmishers were usually the first to open the encounter. Their purpose wasn't just to inflict casualties, but also to provoke movement, disrupt formation, and honestly, to test the other side's resolve. At battles like Agincourt in 1415, English longbowmen shaped the engagement long before heavy infantry even collided. Muddy terrain and arrow fire combined to exhaust and disorder the advancing French forces well before close combat became decisive. Infantry advances were, well, deliberate. The men knew all too well that breaking formation basically meant death. Shields overlapped, spears extended forward, and the psychological tension of closing distance under threat was just immense. When contact finally happened, it wasn't some open swirl of individual duels. No, it was pressure. Bodies pressed forward, shields locked, weapons thrust in really limited arcs. Space was, honestly, so constrained and visibility was poor. The goal wasn't dramatic swordplay. It was to push, destabilize, and create a fracture in the enemy line. Most of the killing actually happened after one side broke. One of the most overlooked realities of medieval warfare is that the majority of casualties occurred during rout, not during the main clash. As long as formation held, casualties were, often limited. Armor was effective, shields were protective, but once morale collapsed, once a unit turned to flee, the protective structure just disappeared. Men dropped shields to run, they stumbled, and horses trampled retreating infantry. Organized resistance simply dissolved. At that moment, pursuit determined the scale of loss. Cavalry played a crucial role here. A disciplined mounted force could honestly transform a retreat into slaughter. This is exactly why reserves were so important. Commanders who committed all their forces at once often lacked the capacity to exploit a break. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 really shows just how fragile morale could be. Feigned retreats by Norman cavalry induced portions of the English shield wall to break formation in pursuit. Once cohesion failed, localized advantage turned into systemic collapse. The lesson was clear and, widely understood in later centuries. Maintaining formation under pressure was more important than individual valor. Survival depended on discipline. Terrain mattered more than bravery. Battles were not fought on random open fields. Terrain was selected, when possible, to shape the fight. High ground provided visibility and defensive advantage. Marshy or narrow terrain neutralized cavalry superiority. Wooded areas disrupted large formations. Rivers and bridges created choke points. At Agincourt, again, the muddy narrow field compressed the French advance and rendered heavy cavalry ineffective. At Bannockburn in 1314, Scottish forces used terrain and prepared defensive positions to counter English mounted knights. The ground itself became a force multiplier. Medieval commanders understood terrain intuitively, even without formal military academies. Survival depended on reading the landscape. For the common soldier, terrain determined whether exhaustion would overtake him before the enemy did. Modern military doctrine still reflects these lessons. Control of elevation, supply routes, and mobility corridors remain central to strategy. Medieval battles were early demonstrations of environmental realism in warfare. Armor did not make men invincible, but it did shape the rhythm of combat. Another misconception is that armor rendered medieval fighting either brutally lethal or theatrically ineffective. The reality is more nuanced. Quality armor was remarkably protective against slashing blows. This meant combat required targeted thrusts, blunt force trauma, or attacks to joints and weak points. Fighting was physically demanding. Men in heavy armor overheated quickly. Stamina became a limiting factor. Combat, therefore, had rhythm. Short bursts of violent contact were followed by moments of regrouping and reformation. Exhaustion was as dangerous as enemy steel. Knights were not indestructible warriors charging endlessly through infantry. They were elite shock troops whose effectiveness depended on timing, terrain, and coordination. When cavalry charges failed or terrain constrained movement, heavily armored men became liabilities rather than assets. This reality, drove gradual shifts in military organization. Infantry armed with pole arms and pikes became increasingly capable of resisting mounted elites. Over time, this eroded the battlefield dominance of the knightly class and reshaped European power structures. The psychological experience of battle was defined by noise, fear, and uncertainty. The sensory environment of a medieval battle is rarely discussed with precision. Noise from horns, shouting, clashing metal, and animals created disorientation. Dust limited visibility. Command signals were easily lost. Fear was not abstract. It was immediate and contagious. Morale depended heavily on proximity to trusted leaders and familiar banners. Once those markers disappeared, cohesion deteriorated. Medieval chroniclers often described moments when rumors of a leader's death triggered collapse, even when untrue. This really underscores how fragile battlefield psychology was. For survival-minded viewers, this matters. Human beings under extreme stress revert to training and group cohesion. Armies that drilled more consistently, that trusted their leaders, and that maintained visible structure were more likely to endure shock without breaking. This principle echoes across history, from medieval levies to 20th century infantry formations. Cohesion outperforms courage alone. After the fighting stopped, the consequences were immediate and, honestly, long-lasting. Victory did not end hardship. Wounded men required care. In an era with, pretty limited medical knowledge, ransoming captured nobles became a political and economic process. Looting could undermine discipline and alienate local populations. Defeat could reshape borders, dynasties, and succession lines overnight. The Battle of Towton in 1461 during the Wars of the Roses was not merely a clash of arms. It reconfigured English political power. Hastings altered the language, culture, and ruling class of England for centuries. Battles were inflection points. They determined taxation, land ownership, and geopolitical alignment. Yet they were often decided by, mundane factors, weather, fatigue, poor reconnaissance, or just a single failed maneuver. Understanding this reframes medieval warfare as a system of pressures rather than a sequence of heroic episodes. What medieval battles reveal about preparedness and human limits? When viewed without cinematic distortion, medieval battles offer, some pretty sober lessons. Preparation outweighed spectacle. Cohesion outweighed individual skill. Terrain outweighed bravado. Morale outweighed numbers in many cases. These patterns continued into early modern warfare and even into industrial conflict. Technology changes, but human endurance, fear, communication limits, and environmental constraints remain constants. The medieval battlefield was not chaos for its own sake. It was a fragile test of organization under stress. Armies that survived did so because their structures held when others fractured. That is the reality often ignored. Battles were less about glorious combat and more about maintaining order in conditions designed to destroy it. Remembering what actually happened in medieval battles matters because it strips away romanticism and restores complexity. It reminds us that warfare is shaped by logistics, psychology, leadership, and environment, not cinematic heroics. When we understand that, we gain clearer insight into how societies rise, fall, and adapt under pressure. If you value this kind of grounded, in-depth historical analysis, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts and share this video with others who want more than surface-level summaries. History deserves careful attention.